Welcome to the Animal Training Fundamentals podcast, where we have fun with practical application and we get mental with the science of behavior. Put them both together and you get results, solutions for your behavior problems, and the tools you need to achieve your training goals. I'm your host, Barbara Heidenreich. Let's talk training. Hey, animal lovers, it's Barbara Heidenreich here. So glad to be back with you on the Animal Training Fundamentals podcast. I've been out on the road like crazy this fall, so it's been a little challenging to record these for you. I'm very excited to be talking to you now because I've got a great topic. I'm going to be talking to you about addressing undesired repetitive behavior. Now, some people like to think of this as stereotypies, but we're going to talk about the difference, why it's not a stereotypy every single time we're talking about repetitive behavior. There's actually a difference. So hang on, and we're going to dive deep into this topic. Well, first of all, we need to talk about what exactly is a stereotypy. Now, I like to use the definition by Turner, and he defines stereotypy as something that's very repetitive, of course, but there's a rigidity to it and sort of an invariance to the behavior. We tend to think of it as inappropriate and that it serves no real function. So we're talking about things where the behavioral needs of the animal are not actually met. But one of the things that you have to think about with repetitive behavior is that not all repetitive behavior is stereotypic. So one of the things that I often see when I'm consulting with zoos is that we see that the repetitive behavior is actually being reinforced. And that's probably the most common thing that I see, is that repetitive behavior is reinforced. And so the animal is actually doing it because it works for the animal. So it absolutely serves a function for the animal. So therefore, it's not really a stereotypic behavior. And in many cases, the animal only does it under very specific circumstances. There's not a rigidity to it whatsoever. It's actually quite predictable, and it's being maintained by consequences. So one of the things we need to do when we start looking at repetitive behavior is we need to do a little bit more investigating. We need to start asking some questions. And one of the really cool things that I did along with Annetta Peterson and Jim Mackey — Annetta Peterson's the training coordinator for the Copenhagen Zoo, and Jim Mackey does the same service for the Zoological Society of London — we got together and put together a really fantastic document that lists a bunch of questions that you can use to help you start looking at repetitive behavior and seeing if there's a lot more to it so that you can start changing things. You can actually start addressing these repetitive behaviors instead of saying, oh, it's just a stereotypy, there's nothing to be done about it, or throwing enrichment at the animal and seeing if that makes a difference, because in many cases that's not really the appropriate action. So let's take a look at some of these questions. The first question we definitely want to ask is, are there identifiable triggers, or what we might call antecedents to the behavior? What are those circumstances in which the animal does the behavior? I think a great classic example is, let's say it's afternoon and it's about feeding time, and the animal's anticipating that the door is about to be opened in order to be let into an area. And the animal's anticipating being let into an area where it's about to be fed. That's a pretty specific situation that might trigger an animal pacing back and forth in front of the door. So you're seeing some repetitive behavior there. And guess what? If that door opens while the animal's doing that activity, that behavior is going to get reinforced. And if that starts happening at a very sort of unpredictable schedule, in other words, the animal never really knows when that door is going to open, then the animal starts thinking, well, I just need to do this for longer and longer duration because I never know when that door might open. It becomes very unpredictable to the animal. And so the animal learns, do the behavior for a long time. In fact, that is a strategy we use to train duration behaviors. So you could actually be teaching the animal to do a repetitive behavior for a very long time by using that particular strategy. So those are a couple more of the questions that we often ask. Can we also identify reinforcers for the behavior? So the example I just gave you there is that the animal may be getting fed after it's been doing the repetitive behavior and the door opens and it goes through the door. And then, of course, the intermittent schedule of reinforcement, which I just mentioned right there, could be putting it on a long, on some long duration there. So here's some other things you can look for. Is there body language that tells you the animal is anticipating delivery of desired consequences? So that could be, like I just mentioned with that one example, access to desired food, but maybe it's also access to things like preferred buddies, a male waiting to get to access to females, or maybe it's a low man on the totem pole that doesn't like being separated from the rest of the group. All those things could create a situation where the animal's very anxious to get back to other animals. And that could be an animal that's anticipating access to something it really wants. It doesn't just have to be food. So think about that. And it doesn't have to be access to something it likes. It also could be body language that means vigilance or anticipation of something it doesn't like. So, what about the animal that's going, oh, you know what? I see the veterinarian's coming and I've had some bad experiences with a veterinarian. So, you may see an animal that's presenting repetitive behavior, pacing, hoping to get away from something. Maybe it's waiting for the door to open so it can escape. And you might see repetitive behavior there, pacing to get out of the door, to get away from that experience. So also look for fear responses, anticipation of undesired consequences. It could even be displacement by a dominant animal. Maybe that animal wants to get away from another animal in the group. So again, you might see repetitive behavior related to undesired consequences, not just the anticipation of something good. Now, remember I said when we were defining the stereotypy in the beginning that there's a lot of rigidity to the behavior. So are you seeing variance in the patterns of the behavior, or is it pretty rigid? Does the animal show some changes in the behavior that it does? And what about pain? Could the animal be experiencing pain? Some animals move to give some relief of pain that they might be experiencing. And here's something else that you might not think about is that pain may only happen at certain times of the year or maybe even the month. It could be related to temperature, it could be related to reproductive cycles. And so it may not happen all the time, and that may throw you for a loop. So you really may need to evaluate that animal for some very specific health issues that may take a little detective work to really see what's going on there. Another thing you need to consider is that the animal may not have the opportunity to express a full range of species typical movement or the kind of energy that it needs to express in a 24-hour period. And that also may change for the different life cycles of the species. One of the really cool things we did at a European Association of Zoos and Aquariums conference with the Animal Training Working Group is we did a little workshop where we looked at some video clips of animals doing repetitive behaviors, and we kind of let the group work together to try and see if we could figure out why the animal might be doing repetitive behavior. And we put all of our heads together, and all of our groups of people with their different areas of expertise put some input in there. And for one example, we had a tiger that was just kind of walking around its enclosure in a semi-repetitive manner. It really came down to that this was a young male tiger that at this age would be kind of expanding his territory. He would be looking for more areas to move into. And so he just kind of needed to move around more for his age group and what he would be doing at that particular age. Here's something else to consider. What about the repetitive behavior being something that we think doesn't look very good, but is actually kind of normal for the species? Maybe our perception of the repetitive behavior is just unpleasant, but it's actually just a normal thing for the animal. So another question we should ask, it might take a little exploring and digging into the natural history of the species. Now, could the behavior be learned from a neighboring animal? One thing to consider about stereotypic behavior is that it really cannot be learned from another animal, but repetitive behavior could be learned from another animal. They could learn that it works to get desired consequences, like banging on a door gets doors to open so that you can get access to things that you want. Again, not a stereotypic behavior, but a learned behavior. So you'll need to keep investigating if more than one animal is presenting the repetitive behavior. Another thing to consider is if there is a genetic predisposition for repetitive behavior. Could the animal have a history of early weaning that's affected its social behavior? And maybe it was raised independent of its species. Maybe it was imprinted on humans or not provided enough species specific socialization opportunities when it was young. This may have affected its behavior, so perhaps it doesn't behave normally. And is it a social animal that's been living in social isolation for a period of time? This could be influencing some of its behavioral repertoire. So these are some questions that you may want to look at as you evaluate repetitive behavior that's going on with your animal. Now, the real question, though, is what to do if you're seeing repetitive movements. How do you address these things? So here's some things to consider. First of all, if we think it's just repetitive behavior that's got some triggers and some reinforcement activity going on, first thing we want to do is put that behavior on extinction. In other words, we're never going to reinforce repetitive movements if we can possibly do that. And it's really important to never reinforce, right? Because if we occasionally reinforce the behavior, then we're putting it on that intermittent schedule. So every once in a while, it actually works. And that can make animals have really strong behaviors, right? Because the animal thinks, well, I'm just going to keep trying and trying and trying because every once in a while it'll pay off. And so it's really important that we truly, truly never reinforce. So that can be really challenging sometimes. Extinction is a tough thing to apply, but if you apply it well, it can be a really effective tool. Of course, going hand in hand with that is avoiding the triggers for the undesired behavior, if at all possible. So that means, of course, you've got to identify what those triggers are. And then what goes along with that as well is training a desired response under less triggering conditions. So think about those situations where we're talking about animals that might pace at the door anticipating a meal. Could you train a nice behavior like a stationing behavior before you're going to open that door? But that doesn't mean you're going to have somebody standing right there at the door, ready to pull that door open right at mealtime. You might practice having the animal station at a time where it's very easy for the animal to do that behavior, build some nice reinforcement history for the animal sitting on its station. Once you've got that nice reinforcement history built up, you might work towards the person that's going to be operating the door, getting closer and closer to the door, reinforce the animal for staying on the station, and eventually you're going to open that door, release the animal from the station, and then it goes through the door with no pacing behavior whatsoever. Then eventually you're going to raise that criteria so the animal gives the correct response under the right conditions. So, at feeding time, hopefully the animal's waiting patiently at its station. You reinforce at the station, you go over, you open the door, and the animal passes through and gets its dinner inside. And then you can put that behavior on an intermittent schedule of reinforcement if you would like to, so that the animal never knows when reinforcers will be delivered for waiting on that station, or whatever behavior you're trying to address in terms of trying to teach some other behavior to do instead of that repetitive behavior. That's ideally our goal, so that we're not constantly having to deliver reinforcers at a very rapid fire rate for animals doing the correct behavior under those triggering circumstances. Now, if the animal really is giving you what we would consider a true stereotypy, and we can't identify triggers or reinforcers maintaining behavior, you are going to want to evaluate the natural history of the species and the habitat that you're providing the animal. And you may have to look at things like environmental enrichment. Are we meeting the ecological needs of the species in question? And maybe those things need to be really ramped up to address the problem. We always, of course, want to deliver enrichment when the animal is giving correct responses. You don't want to deliver that enrichment at the moment the animal is presenting the undesired behavior, because then we could potentially be reinforcing the repetitive behavior. And of course, there's other things you can include in the repertoire, like a really solid training program so that the animal's engaged in other activities, so that we keep that animal's life as full as possible, so it's not thinking about doing repetitive behaviors. So some strategies I also wanted to talk about that you want to consider avoiding, that sometimes end up falling into people's repertoire just because they get a little desperate. It's challenging and hard sometimes when people see animals doing repetitive behavior. It concerns people for good reason. Sometimes what people do is just try to stop the animal from doing the behavior by blocking the animal from doing the behavior. So think about things like putting on an e-collar so that the animal doesn't actively chew on a spot or something. Maybe they're chewing on their tail all the time as a repetitive behavior. But think about think about that response blocking. It doesn't really take away the good sensation the animal may get from chewing on its tail. It just makes it so the animal can't do it. So the moment that that collar comes off, the animal's probably going to go back to doing the behavior. So it doesn't really address the underlying motivation, and it doesn't really fix your problem. So we're just blocking the animal from doing the activity. So it may be a temporary fix, but it's not going to take care of things in the long haul. And the other thing that sometimes people do that can actually make more problems is they'll do things like move furniture around. So say an animal is doing a repetitive behavior in a certain part of the habitat, they'll move furniture so that the animal can't do that repetitive behavior in that part of the habitat. So what the animal does is it starts doing the repetitive behavior in another part of the habitat. And now the animals started doing repetitive behavior in two areas of the habitat. And so people start putting more stuff in that area, so the animal won't do it over there, and now it does it in another part. So basically, instead of causing the animal to do less repetitive behavior, now we've got to choose, it's learning to adapt and do it in more parts of the enclosure instead of doing it in just the one spot where it originally started. So you want to be careful with this strategy of changing the environment so the animal can't present the behavior, because maybe it'll stop the behavior momentarily, but what it ends up doing is generalizing the behavior to other locations. All right, so there's some things to really think about when it comes to repetitive behavior and stereotypies. And the cool thing is all of this is in a fabulous document that we put together for you, and I'm going to make it available to you at animaltrainingfundamentals.com. Just go to our podcast page, and you will be able to download this document so that you can refer to it anytime you want and see if it can help you address a repetitive behavior problem. I hope you enjoy that, and I hope you enjoyed this podcast and look for more down the pipeline in the future. I also wanted to tell you about some events I've got coming up down the road if you'd like to see me speak in person. February 21st through 24th, I'll be at the Art and Science of Animal Training Conference in Hurst, Texas, which is not too far from Dallas. And I am going to be talking about exotic animal training, the constructional approach to addressing extreme fear and aggressive behavior. This is a super fascinating topic. Think about, what do you do if you're working with animals that are so afraid they won't even take food from you? How do you get started? I've got lots of great video examples to share with you there. And I am planning on being at the Animal Behavior Management Alliance Conference in the Netherlands in March. And I will be at the Southwest Veterinarian Symposium in Fort Worth, Texas in September, and also the European Association of Zoos and Aquariums Conference in Germany in September. And I'm also going to be at Academic Animals in East Yorkshire in the UK in October of 2020. So a number of things on the calendar. And don't forget, join me in animaltrainingfundamentals.com if you want to learn all sorts of wonderful things about training animals. You can try it out for just $1 for 10 days. Just go to animaltrainingfundamentals.com for more details, pick a membership, and try the code, try 10 days, and you will be able to access that. That's it for this week's podcast. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to seeing you on another show.
If you liked what you heard today, visit animaltrainingfundamentals.com for more quality content on animal training. You'll find courses, community, and extensive video examples from my consulting work around the world. We'd love to have you join our force-free family.